Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this international live broadcast. My name is Stefan Toxtov. I'm speaking to you from Berlin, Germany. Now, we might just be days away from the outbreak of a new war, and this time in Syria. Syria and also Iran are targets for destruction, regardless of whatever specifics the media would lead you to believe are happening in these nations. Now, any such war at this stage could and would immediately develop into a thermonuclear world war involving the nations of Russia and also China. Now, we will be joined tonight live by Helga LaRouche to address this webcast. Mrs. LaRouche is chairwoman of the BÜSO party, Bürgerrechtsbewegung Solidarität, the civil rights movement Solidarity, and she is also the president of the International Schiller Institute. Already back in November, Mrs. LaRouche issued a forceful intervention with her international call to action to stop World War III. This call has been translated into at least 11 languages and launched a worldwide mobilization which has been followed by many actions and statements around the world. But as anyone with a clear mind can see, we are on the edge of a cliff, and the driver for the immediacy of war, the total disintegration of this worldwide financial system, is as present as ever. This is why Mrs. LaRouche has decided to appear live tonight before an international audience to outline the steps to not only avert this looming war, but to solve the financial and economic crisis. And obviously, an important aspect of this webcast is to be an international dialogue. So I ask you to send your questions during this webcast to webcast@buso.de, which is webcast@bueso.de, and we will do our very best to address them as they come in. So without any further ado, I would like to welcome and present to you our main speaker tonight, Helga LaRouche.
Good evening. Actually, this webcast originally was meant to address primarily a European audience, but because of the urgency of the strategic situation, and since I'm presently nearby Washington, I decided to do this webcast in English. And I'm addressing myself to those of you who recognize that civilization right now is in mortal danger. It should be obvious to any thinking human being on this planet that the continuation of the present policies is possibly leading to the extinction of the human species. And I appeal to you, at least those who agree with me, to join the mobilization, to do everything in your capability to stop this danger of civilizational collapse. Now, it is not true that this catastrophe is inevitable. And in the beginning, before I go into some rather heavy material, I want to say, rule out the idea out of your thinking that one cannot do anything anyway. This sentence, which is the most spoken sentence in Germany, man kann ja sowieso nichts machen, one cannot do anything anyway. I don't want to address this situation from that standpoint. There are solutions, and they can be implemented in time, but it requires a very drastic and dramatic fundamental change of the system, of the global financial order, and an equally dramatic change in the thinking of most people. Now, we are confronted right now with two immediate crises. One is the immediate collapse of the transatlantic financial system, which is already leading to the collapse and the breakup of the euro, as we can see most clearly in the situation in Greece. But if Greece leaves the euro, which it will have to, it has no other choice, this will mean the breakup of the euro and, in all likelihood, the entire EU. Secondly, we have the immediate danger of a thermonuclear war triggered by the events around Syria and Iran, but not really focused on these two countries, but actually aiming at the regime change or destruction, disintegration of Russia and China. Obviously, what I'm saying here is not what you read in Bild-Zeitung or what you listen to in other mass media. But I can assure you, I would not say these things lightly. I'm trying to address the reality of the situation as it is, because only if you look at it in the most rational and most unblocked fashion can you find the necessary remedy. The name of the game is empire, or more precisely British Empire. Now I know that there are a lot of people who say, what, British Empire, it ceased to exist since a long time. But if you understand that the empire, which has been dominating the European and actually global situation for almost 4,000 years, has a tendency to come back in ever new clothes, in new shapes and forms like a slime mold, and this time it has another name called globalization. If you understand under British Empire the complex system of central banks, investment banks, hedge funds, private equity funds, insurance companies, the shadow banking, then you know what I mean by British Empire. It is that financial system which has been responsible for the paradigm shift in the last 40 to 45 years, shifting away from the production of physical goods, the so-called real economy, more and more to speculation, to the idea of profit maximization and pure monetarism. As long as the Soviet Union existed, that system of globalization had certain constraints because the Soviet Union existed as a second superpower. But when the Warsaw Pact started to disintegrate between 89 and 91, the world had reached a turning point. With the communist system gone, there would have been the chance for a new peace order of the 21st century. There was no more enemy, and one could have used the economic and scientific resources of the entire world to go for the solution of those urgent tasks of mankind which were then there and they still are, namely the elimination of hunger, the development of the underdeveloped sector, joint scientific breakthroughs to reach the next level of mankind's development. Instead, rather than the United States recognizing the chance to go back and reconfirm the principles of the American Revolution, which had made America to be a temple of liberty and a beacon of freedom, unfortunately with the Bush senior administration, the neocons appeared and declared the New American Century Doctrine, which was the idea to run the world as an empire based on the Anglo-American special relationship. Now, we, from the international LaRouche movement, we had a plan, which was the productive triangle and later the Eurasian land bridge, which would have been the basis for such a peace order, which, however, for reasons which I shortly will mention, was rejected. At that time, the policy of regime change was adopted in every country which would not be willing to submit to this empire. Now, the first expression of such regime change was the first Gulf War, which started in August 1990, which was called Operation Desert Storm, which had the explicit goal to bomb Iraq back into the Stone Age, and it did. The policy this policy was interrupted between 1992 and 2000 in the 8 years of the Clinton administration, but it remained in the background in the form of the clean break policy, which was the idea of having regime change of every country not friendly to Israel, which was around even during the Clinton years, and as a clear response to the efforts of President Clinton to have peace in the Middle East through the Oslo Accords. It was adopted by the Netanyahu government then. And it came fully back with the Bush and Cheney administration and all the time being pursued by the British government. Now with George W. Bush Jr., who declared these countries to be the axis of evil, the next target was the Second Iraq War, which, as we now know, was based completely on lies, developed through MI5 and Tony Blair, and that was then the basis for the speech Colin Powell gave in the United Nations, which he later called to be the worst mistake he ever made in his life. Now, this was behind the war of aggression against Libya and the assassination of Gaddafi, because at that point the forces pushing these regime changes could not wait to put Gaddafi on trial, because they already had in mind a continuation of this campaign against Syria and Iran. A trial would have been too long, and Gaddafi may have told some very unpleasant details about his dealings with his previous collaborators. Now this campaign is reaching Syria and Iran, and it has almost nothing to do with these countries, but it is aimed at Russia and China. And when you hear the stories about Syria and about Iran, you should have a déjà vu experience. It's the same accusations against Iran, what we heard about Iraq, and the recent report of the International Atomic Energy Agency that Iran would have the nuclear bomb maybe in 1 year, or be able to put its facility underground so that they would not be reachable anymore, is in complete contradiction to the US National Intelligence estimate from October 2011, where they confirmed the findings of the report's evaluation from 2007, that Iran had stopped its military nuclear program in 2003. And as many people also observed, the entire information the International Atomic Energy Agency used came from Western intelligence sources, and the former head of this agency, Hans Blix, also said that there was absolutely no new information given. So this war has already begun. NBC News just a couple of days ago reported that the Israeli Mossad has been recruiting and training members of the MEK, the Mujahedin-e-Khalq organization, which still, I believe, is on the terrorist list of the State Department, training them for assassinations and bombings inside Iran. This was confirmed by officials of the Obama administration and restated in an interview by Mohammad Larijani, who is the brother of the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament, Ali Larijani, who reported to NBC that Iranian officials caught MEK members attempting to assassinate Iranian nuclear scientists, and Larijani then proposed that the United States should bring Israel before the UN Security Council for state-sponsored terrorism, in line with its still ongoing policy of a war against terrorism. Now remember that there were in the last 2 years several explosions in Iranian nuclear facilities, and 4 nuclear scientists have been assassinated according to the same MO in the last 2 years. The Russian Foreign Ministry was very concerned about reports that, according to the Israeli website Debka File, which was then later confirmed by the Institute for Oriental Studies of the Russian Academy of Sciences, that British and Qatari special forces are operating in Syria. And the Russian government said very clearly that they are very concerned about the violation of Syrian sovereignty by these acts. And that these mercenaries from Qatar, Great Britain and possibly Saudi Arabia are there to provide ammunition to the rebels in Homs in large quantities. Now, since the last months of the last year, there has been a gigantic build-up of military forces in the Gulf, in the Indian Ocean and in the Eastern Mediterranean. There are 2 aircraft carriers in the Gulf region, and the 3rd will arrive there in March, together with a lot of frigates, destroyers, cruise missiles, and each of these aircraft carriers can launch hundreds of combat aircrafts. there are 8 or more Ohio submarines, each with 24 Trident missiles, out of which each has 6 to 8 100-kiloton nuclear warheads. Each sub, therefore, has a destruction power of 1,476 times the kilotons which were detonated in Hiroshima. And you have to add a certain number of British, Israeli, Canadian, French warships to that. Please first map. So if you look at it, the total firepower which is amassed in this region is in absolutely no relation to the supposed reason, namely, the helping the rebels in Syria or, deterring Iran from a nuclear program. But it is clearly aimed for something else. The US Defense Secretary Panetta has talked about the high probability of Israel attacking Iran between April and June. And sources recently have pointed to a more likely date of April or even earlier. And there are rumors about an attack on Damascus even earlier than that. Now, the Iranian government, through their ambassador to the United Nations, has pointed to the right of Iran to defend itself and that it has the capability to do so. Now, also, since November, in Israel, a fierce debate has broken out where former members or former heads of the Mossad or the Shin Bet and even former Joint Chiefs of Staff have come out and warned that if it would come to such an attack, it not only would put Israel in jeopardy, but it would put the entire region for 100 years into complete chaos and destruction. Now, from the best of my knowledge, from having surveyed the situation, of having access to many informed circles around the world, the Iran war is right now on. It's supposed to occur. And by the very logic of the situation, it will not be limited to the region. Once it starts, there is the absolute danger that it will be global thermonuclear war. Now, the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov declared in this context that an attack on Iran would lead to a chain reaction which would destabilize the whole world, have grave consequences, and nobody would know where it would end. Now, it is, I think, worse than that, because it is the logic of the weapons being here accumulated. You don't start such a war with one nuclear weapon, then wait until retaliation comes, and then maybe have a second one. But it is very clear that we are looking at mutual assured destruction, which was the official NATO doctrine in the time when the Warsaw Pact still existed. Now, one element of this is that thermonuclear weapons are so horrible that you normally, if you are a normal human being, you would think nobody will ever use them because they lead to the extinction of civilization. Now, therefore, the danger is that whoever plans this war would go to launch the entire arsenal by surprise, and basically, to be then the only dominant power. Now, every military expert in Europe or analyst of the Middle East knows and tell you in private discussions that a war against Iran is the equivalent of World War III. And since this is generally known, well, may there be the element of winning the war by a horrible bluff? Now, the idea of a thermonuclear chicken game, remember the chicken game was this experiment they made many decades ago in California, where you have two cars driving towards each other with full speed, and then the one who lost the nerve would, try to escape the clash in the last moment, which obviously is already not very sane. But to do this with nuclear weapons is the height of complete criminality and insanity. Now, it is so insane that it risks the extinction of the human species. If you look at how many military ships and missiles and so forth are accumulated there, how quickly could an accident trigger this? How quickly could you have a Gulf of Tonkin incident which would detonate the whole thing? Now, in retrospect, one can say that the Truman throwing the bombs of, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where there was no need to do that, because the Japanese had already surrendered. There were already negotiations involving the Vatican, so there was no need to throw these bombs. But they were thrown in order to demonstrate the principle of Schrecklichkeit. The principle that, there is a weapon now so horrible that in face of this weapon, nobody will ever be tempted to use it. And it was clearly as a preparation for those who thought maybe after World War II we will have World War III. And remember the famous statement by Bertrand Russell from 1946, where he proposed preemptive nuclear war against the Soviet Union at that time. Now, therefore, the implicit option here is a bluff to say, okay, surrender, if not, we go for thermonuclear global warfare. And it is the forces of the British Empire which are behind it. And again, for a normal human being, very difficult to conceptualize. But there are people who would like to reduce the world population from presently 7 billion to 1 billion people. I mean, Prince Philip has said it many, many times. Others have said it. And it can be documented that such policies exist. Map 2, please. Now, if you look at this present build-up, it is very clear that we are not only talking about Syria and Iran, but Russia and China. Because there is the policy, no, this is not the right map, because Russia has for a long time made the point that the European missile defense system, which has been installed or is being installed in Poland, Czechia, and plans are made for Romania, that they regard this as part of the NATO enlargement towards the east, the encirclement of Russia. Everybody knows that these so-called defensive missile systems can be very quickly turned into offensive systems, and then these missiles could reach Moscow in less than 3 minutes. The Russian Chief of Staff, Makarenko, a couple of months ago already warned that there is, because of this system, the danger of a European nuclear war which could go completely out of control. Now, President Medvedev, in response to President Obama's decision to go ahead with this policy of Bush and Cheney, activated recently the radar systems in Kaliningrad. China came to the same interpretation when Obama shifted his emphasis to the Pacific, building new bases and troops in Australia, Philippines, building new military alliances, that it is really aimed at the encirclement of China. And regime change for Russia and China are on the agenda. For this, you have presently mobilized the same network which is responsible for the Orange Revolution against Ukraine, the Rose Revolution against Georgia, and they are now calling for a white or snow revolution in Moscow. It's the Project Democracy Crowd, the NDI, the National Democratic Institute, the IRI, the International Republican Institute, the Soros Operation, and this whole crowd. It's part of this apparatus is unfortunately the new ambassador to Moscow, Michael McFaul, which in German you could say the Nomen est Omen, fast foul, that is responsible for the NDI since 1990, where he worked for the NDI in Moscow, and who has privately been bragging that he was responsible for the, quote, engineering of the re-election of Boris Yeltsin in 1996, because it was his networks of the NDI which maneuvered somehow to get Yeltsin, who was completely hated by the Russian population at that time, because they correctly blamed him of having sold out Russia to the oligarchs and to the West, and managed somehow his re-election. Now, this apparatus is since September of last year fully mobilized in a campaign to claim that the parliamentarian and presidential election in Russia would be fraudulent. Regime change is also on the agenda for China. Mr. McCain in Munich at the Security Conference called for an Arab Spring in Beijing, which was a clear provocation against the Chinese representative at that conference. Now, this has been the policy of the empire faction since 1990. It is absolutely urgent right now, this map about regime change, please, since 1990. So it has been in place for a long time. You can see here the countries which have been targeted for such regime change. But it is now becoming, from the standpoint of the empire, super urgent, because the transatlantic region is collapsing. While you have relative growth in Asia, China has a growth rate of 8 to 10%, India 7 to 8%, and others similar. Europe and the United States are collapsing. There was an article in People's Daily in the Russian language which said that both Russia and China have recognized that since Putin made the announcement that he plans to return to the presidency, or that he will be a candidate for that the targeting of Russia and China has been put on the agenda, and that therefore these two countries have now built a very strong military alliance against these threats. Now, even before the present escalation, Russia and China had focused on a very advanced scientific and technological orientation, high investments in higher energy flux densities, fourth generation of the inherently safe nuclear energy, the development of the Arctic region, and generally focusing on the new frontiers of science. Russia wants to build the city of Umka, a doomed city in the Russian Arctic for 5,000 residents, which should have full research capabilities, which would be self-sufficient in respect to food production, and it would be modeled on a fictional moon city or an isolated space station. It's planned to be under a dome of 1.2 kilometer long size and 800 meter wide. And it would only cost, by the way, $6 to $8 billion, so peanuts in the present world of bailout packages. And President Putin has made remarkable speeches and written articles that he recognizes that the key problem of the world right now is the bubble economy, and that he is in favor of a system focusing on the production in the real economy. Now, also manned space travel is on the agenda between Russia and China. China has declared that they want to become the leading space power somewhere in the early part of this century. They want to mine helium-3 on the moon, which will be very important for thermonuclear fusion power. And in general, you can see that Asia is relatively prospering while the transatlantic region is collapsing. Now, I have to say this very clearly. The British Empire, defined as I did earlier, rather goes for World War III than leaving the Asian powers to become the leading nations on the planet. And, this despite the fact that, the euro has been proven to be a complete failure, as you can see nowhere more clearly than in the case of Greece, which is right now at the complete point of explosion. As we are speaking here, or as I'm speaking here, the leading trade unions in Greece have called for a popular uprising against the deal imposed on Greece by the infamous Troika. The police trade union has advocated the arrest of the members of the Troika, demanding an immediate arrest order, and somebody who has a sense of humor in a leaflet offered €1 for the arrest of the Troika, expressing how much value they give to these people. Now, the population is in complete despair. And if you look at the situation in Greece, I want to give you some figures, because what this present EU policy has done to Greece, which is after all the cradle of European civilization, the birthplace of democracy, and more important of the Solon's idea of the purpose of mankind being progression, as Schiller described it. This country is now totally destroyed and people are really desperate. The 27.7% of the Greek population is below poverty levels. That is 3 out of 10 million. That was in 2010, and 2011 became much worse. Children up to 17 years are in poverty 28.7%. And Greece now is on the level of Latvia, Hungary, Lithuania and Poland. Unemployment is now, in November 2011, 20.9%. This is a 48% increase over 2010. Youth unemployment is now 48%. That means every second youth is unemployed. And 50% of the trained engineers are out of work. Now that's maybe the biggest crime, because these are the people who could start to rebuild the Greek economy. And the debt, since the bailout packages have started, has increased the percentage of the Greek debt to GDP from 120 to 159%. Now, Greek parents increasingly have to abandon their children to SOS children villages because they can't feed them anymore. This is the first time this is happening in Europe. It used to be only the case in Africa and other poor areas. And on top of that, the EU Troika wants to have 150,000 people more cut from the civil service on top of 200,000 already. They want to cut pharmaceutical deliveries from 2.5 billion by 1 billion. Now that means increasing the death rate. I mean, there's no other way of putting it. And they are trying to reduce the minimum wage from 740 euro by another 22%, and for the youth by another 32%. And at the same time, they increase the taxes, 250% increase in property taxes, even for people who have just a tiny little house, and 23% of the VAT tax. So this is the reason why the Greek population is exploding, and they say we cannot continue. Now, obviously, if Greece leaves the euro, it will, in all likelihood, lead to a breakup of the entire eurozone. And that will affect the US banks. In effect, it will probably bring down the entire world financial system. The only reason why this is not happening already is because the Federal Reserve and the EZB are printing money like the Reichsbank did in 1923, which obviously is a very short-lived policy. And some cynics are even saying printing money and causing hyperinflation is the only way how you can reduce the state debt. It's also the most brutal form of expropriation of the population. Now, interestingly, Andreas Voskuhle, who is the president of the Constitutional Court in Karlsruhe, warned in a recent speech that the effort to save the euro and to go for more European integration is threatening the loss of democracy in Europe. Now, while this is obviously a complete understatement, but for somebody in his position, this is quite an admission. Now, the only way how one could get out of this disaster is to admit that the euro was a failed experiment. It could not function because the reason from the beginning was the intention to turn Europe into a subdivision of this same British Empire. If you think back for a moment to 1889, which was, after all, the great historical chance of Europe, Thatcher, Mitterrand and Bush Sr. Forced Germany at the time to give up the D-Mark as the price for unification. Thatcher launched this incredible Fourth Reich campaign. Attali, the advisor of Mitterrand, reports that Mitterrand even threatened to go to war against Germany, and the Bush administration preferred containment through self-containment by putting Germany into the straitjacket of the EU, which they then implemented through the EU treaties from Maastricht to Lisbon. The people were never asked. Referendums in France and Holland were lost, but the rest of the people were never consulted if they wanted this policy. Now, if you look at this Euro experiment, what was the propaganda of its proponents? It should guarantee peace forever in Europe. Well, the reality is never has been so much hatred among the different nations directed against Germany, directed against Greek people, directed against the EU since 1945. Another such lie was strengthening the European position in light of the emerging countries. Now, the disunity being displayed by Europe right now has made Europe the laughingstock of the rest of the world. Strengthening economic powers in Europe. Well, why is Merkel then going as a beggar to the Chinese, asking them to bail out the euro, which the Chinese are obviously too smart to do? Now, Lothar Rühl, the former Defense Secretary, State Secretary, recently wrote in the FAZ that there are new challenges for the European security and defense policy, next map, that basically after the US is now focusing more on the Pacific, that after the Arab Spring, the European responsibility is more for the West. That given the fact that Islamic fundamentalists would still be a great challenge in the war on terror, Europe should focus on the east and south of Libya region, Chad, Sudan, Somalia, the Horn of Africa, the Arab Sea, and in light of this nice policy, the EU just decided to use more drones against refugees from Africa trying to cross the Mediterranean. Now, what this European security and defense policy calls for is expedition corps for interventions, weapons deployable from far, renaissance means air and marine control, strategic troop transport for longer distances over sea and by air, airborne landing capabilities, and so forth and so on. Now, all of this was already in the Lisbon Treaty, which is why we opposed it, among other things, at the time. This policy makes very clear, if you needed one more proof, that Europe is just the regional expression of this global empire. Now, in this present constellation, Europe is making itself the target in a possible war. Now, the newly appointed Russian Deputy Minister Dmitry Rogozin recently warned that basically the problem is that NATO continues to live by the principles set down by NATO Secretary General Lord Ismay, which is keep the Russians out, keep the Americans in, and keep the Germans down. Now, that people in Germany should better think about, And then he warned that the present European missile defense system, that, for example, people in Romania may think it helps them, but in reality, with this policy, the Europeans have become the hostages and targets of a retaliatory attack in case of such a war. Now, therefore, the situation we are facing is similar to that which existed with the middle-range missiles at the beginning of the 80s, when the Pershing II and the SS-20 were deployed, where the reality of the German security situation was that Germany, in case of war, would get one strike from one side and then a second strike from the other and have absolutely no chance for survival. And that is what we are looking at today again. Now, when you look at this insane situation, well, there is a remedy. We have to use the breakup of the euro as a chance. When the collapse of the communist system occurred in '89, it was a tremendous chance to go for a new peace order for the world. Now we experience the second collapse of a system. And this time we must learn the lessons of '89 and not fall in the trap of just perpetuating a system which is already completely bankrupt. Now what we have to do is we have to help Greece to go back to the drachma. The other European nations should adopt D-mark, franc and so forth. We must have sovereignty over our currency and our economy. We must cancel all European Union treaties from Maastricht to Lisbon and go back to the sovereign control of our nations as republics. Now this does not mean that we are anti-Europe, not at all. We are more for Europe than the present EU bureaucrats, who are obviously not caring about the people of Europe in the slightest, neither the Greek nor the Germans nor the Italians. And we have to go to a policy of an alliance of fatherlands in the tradition of de Gaulle. And we should just do what Franklin D. Roosevelt did in the 30s to lead America out of the Depression. Implement immediately Glass-Steagall in the tradition of Roosevelt without any changes. Cancel the fictitious debt, which is approximately, nobody knows exactly because of the shadow banking aspect, but it's probably in the vicinity of 1.5 quadrillion dollar or euro, which is the extent of the entire derivative market, and then go for a credit system as it was established by the first Secretary of Finance in the United States, Alexander Hamilton. Issue credit for future production in accordance with scientific principles given by the physical economy. Investments financed with such a credit must be to increase the energy flex density and go for the next level of breakthrough in scientific and technological breakthroughs. And which steps these have to be, that is absolutely scientifically knowable. I speak to that shortly. Then we have to establish fixed exchange rates, go for a new Bretton Woods system, a credit system among many nations over the next 50 to 100 years. Now, what does it require to do this? As a first step, we have to recognize that Europe, in the context of the present EU, is an oligarchical empire. And we have to reject the idea of oligarchism. We have to recognize that the oligarchical model, which was described very well by Friedrich Schiller in his writing about the laws of Lykurg and Solon, where Sparta was run by a small oligarchical elite and they kept the masses of people deliberately stupid, where they had the right to cull the herd, so to speak, whenever they became too many, and allowing the use of Sparta, for example, to shoot the helots, that system has to go forever. Now, people may not recognize it, but the reality is that the world has been living under an oligarchical imperial structure for the last 4,000 years. You first had, at some point, the Persian Empire. When Greece had won over that Persian Empire, they could have turned the Attic Sea Alliance into an alliance of equal partners, but they decided to become an empire instead. This was described by Thucydides in the Peloponnesian War. This was then followed by the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Crusades, which were wars on behalf of the Venice banking system, and the British Empire, which exists in 1763 in various forms until today, in the form of globalization and the Anglo-American special relationship. Now, I know people will get upset and say, Europe, the EU, an empire. Well, why do people then say, you can't do anything anyway? What does that say about the system you are living under if that is what you think? Obviously, it is an oligarchical dictatorship which does not give the individual the possibility of intervention. Why do you think it is that the European governments and the G20 governments, since 4.5 years, since the outbreak of the present global financial crisis in July 2007, have done almost nothing to rein in a totally deregulated financial system? Why have people, heads of government, become nothing but the mouthpieces of this financial oligarchical order? Now, the oligarchy, which will be shown in the future, will turn out to have been nothing than a meander in evolution, an aberration, a dysplasia. Now, the oligarchical model assumes a universe which does not exist. It is based on the idea that the second law of thermodynamics is valid. It's based on the ideas of the Club of Rome, with their infamous idea of limits to growth, that the world is a closed system and that we have somehow reached an equilibrium with finite resources, and that therefore population growth in this closed system is the biggest threat to the privileges of the ruling elite. Now, that was clearly expressed by Kissinger in his infamous NSM 200 document already in 1974. It happens to be also the ideology of the Nazis with their idea of Lebensraum, because after all the planet is finite. It is the very core of the idea of British geopolitics, which led Mackinder and Milner at the end of the turn to the 20th century to develop this crazy idea that whoever controls the Eurasian heartland is controlling the globe. It was what led to World War I, and it is now threatening to lead to World War III. The oligarchical model is associated with monetarism, with the idea of maximization of profit for the power elite, the impoverization of masses of population, and it is behind keeping that privilege through the bailout packages since 2007. It is also related to the idea of an intrinsic value of money. Money? Well, money, the present volume of money out there, all you have to do is push the delete button of your computer and it all goes. Or, if the Fed and the EZB are continuing to print money as they are doing right now, it will also evaporate, and you soon can have wallpaper with 1 trillion notes of dollars and euro, as it was in 1923 in Germany. The oligarchical model is also associated with greenism, environmentalism, people who put beetles above human beings. It's associated with Mother Nature, the idea of Gaia, the cyclical ever return of the same. It's the idea of a universe in the tradition of Nietzsche, that only out of the destruction the good new can come. ideas of Schumpeter, which are right now determining the entire economic policy of the EU, and the idea of conservation of limited resources, saving, sparen, keep the world as an equilibrium. It's absurd, but it's being peddled by the media, by the governments, by the anthropocenic climate change crowd, by the hedge funds who make big profit through that. And it is completely wacky. It is not the universe in which we are living in. The universe is creative. The universe develops in an anti-entropic way. And my husband, Lyndon LaRouche, and his basement crew have made recent breakthroughs by investigating more closely the recent 500 million years of the assumed 13.7 billion years of the existence of the universe, that basically in this period you had 5 extinctions, and the last 2 major ones, the so-called PT and KT extinction, were really revealing that, these studies made clear that there were not really great kills, killing up to 96% of all living species at that time, but that only those organisms survived who were ready to increase the energy flux density, which is the principle of the universe at large. And that proves, these 500 million last years prove beyond any doubt that the second law of thermodynamics is not valid in the universe at large. Now, is our planet part of this universe, or is our planet somehow outside of the universe? No, obviously not. Since the existence of mankind, which is approximately 7 million years ago, which in a large scale is 1 minute before midnight, since that period, human creativity has become the driving force in the development of this development. The law of the universe very clearly is anti-entropy, and the increase of energy flux densities has been proven over hundreds of millions of years to be the genetic law of evolution. The development from the inorganic to the biological to human creativity, a distinction which was first recognized by the great thinker Nicolaus of Cusa already in the 15th century, and which was developed by Vernadsky and his notion of the noosphere, has the correct idea that we are dealing with an increase of the energy of the system. Now, Lyndon LaRouche developed this notion of the relative potential population density as a reflection of this law of the universe almost 50 years ago. It is also true for the development of the species on the planet, that on each level of development the resources are relatively limited, and either the species becomes intelligent enough to reach the next higher level of energy flux density, or it goes under. This is why the dinosaurs went under, and why the super large mammals like the mammoth also didn't make it. Now, the oligarchs today are such a species. One can debate if they are dinosaurs or mammoths. In any case, their mental metabolism is such that the amount of consumption in the form of primitive accumulation in relation to their intelligence of their mind is not effective. Like the mammoths, they will end as a dead end, as a blind alley of evolution, and they will disappear. The only danger is that they will take the human race with it. Now the question therefore is, are there enough intelligent people on this planet who act on the basis of this recognition that civilization is about to crash against the wall, and are willing to change it? Can we willfully go to the next level of development, of evolution, if you so will, rather than staying in the realm of the so-called equilibrium, limited sources, geopolitical wars, thermonuclear destruction, and the extinction of civilization. Are we ready to make the next jump in evolution? Which means the next level of energy flux density, thermonuclear fusion, go for a crash program, to have matter-antimatter reaction. Manned space travel to the moon and Mars as a mission. Are we able to deal together with the galactic threats which are clearly influencing our planet through changes in the weather patterns, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and so forth? Now, the astronauts and cosmonauts who came back recently from the ISS space station in their press conference basically said that the dinosaurs made the mistake not putting their DNA on other planets, and therefore they could not survive these similar challenges. Now, the key is to recognize that the second law of thermodynamics is a fraud. The universe is not running down and tending towards an increasing disorder, but contrary, there is a tendency of increasing anti-entropy. The evolution does not occur from below, like Darwin had tried to argue. It's not the survival of the fittest. It is from above. It's what both Nikolaus of Kues and Vernadsky recognized, that it is the higher species which rips above the lower one, pulls it upward. Now, since the existence of the human species, the human mind is the highest element in the universe, at least for now, until we may discover other life in this universe, which could exist, but we don't know. Now, the human species is the one, therefore, up to now, which willfully can cause a jump in its evolution. It's what Friedrich Schiller already wrote as a little diagram. What the plant is, you, human being, be willfully. And that he could say before one really knew about photosynthesis. Now, an old friend of us, Kraft Erika, who in the Apollo program was responsible for the development of the Centaur rocket and the Atlas rocket, made a beautiful comment by saying, the world is finite only to those who are slaves of the pessimistic zero growth ideology. It's infinite for those who adopt the extraterrestrial imperative. Now, he also developed the beautiful idea that space colonization is the next necessary step of evolution. That life in this evolution developed through photosynthesis from the oceans to the land, then developed higher flux density levels by infrastructure, by new inventions, redefining what the source of energy was. And this based on the necessity to always outpace the effect of attrition if one stays on the same level in production and consumption, or the effect of the evolutionary process that basically has led again and again to the extinction of species in the past, of species who did not contribute to the rising requirements for energy throughput in the biosphere as a whole. Kraft Erika already many decades ago defined the industrialization of the moon and the colonization of Mars as the goal. And I can fully endorse that, because that subsumes virtually all necessary breakthroughs in the realm of science and culture, which we need to master if we want to have a continued existence of civilization. It requires the nuclear fusion propulsion for the travel to Mars, because you don't want to spend 9 months with unbelievable effects on the bodies of the astronaut, but with thermonuclear fusion propulsion, you could reduce that to a couple of days or weeks at most. So therefore, the going to Mars must be a commitment we make now, even if it takes maybe 3 or even 4 generations before we actually can start about building new cities on Mars, it determines the directionality where we want to go. It determines the investments in what industrial inventions or investments we must have, which higher flux density technologies must be applied. And this obviously is only possible through a credit system and not through remaining in a monetary system. Now, this increase of energy flux density must become the yardstick if an investment in industry is good or bad. Now, the former Russian academician Pobyesk Kuznetsov, when he encountered the theory of Mr. Larouche of the relative potential population density, was very happy, and he said, well, you know, given the fact that great inventions often carry the name of their author, like Watt, Ampere, that he said that Mr. Larouche will be recognized for his invention of the relative potential population density as the La. So that will be known in the future as the La. Now, the extraterrestrial imperative Kraft-Ericke has been talking about must be and will be the next step of evolution. Now, we are faced with a possible extinction either through thermonuclear war or a dark age because of the disintegration of the financial system. Now, the question is, can we change and choose the alternative? Now, we can go this way by turning Europe again into an alliance of sovereign nations, of sovereign republics. Why do we not, together with Russia, China, India, the United States, and other nations, go for the common aims of mankind? While we have them, the building of the World Land Bridge, the development of the Arctic as the new frontier of science, building Navapa, going for the Bering Strait, building Transaqua and other infrastructure projects for Africa, go for space colonization. Well, why don't we just do that? Doesn't it make more sense than to destroy ourselves through nuclear war? Now, Kraft-Ericke, who was a good friend of ours, also made another point which I want to emphasize. He said that science and technological progress always must be combined with classical culture, with the aesthetical education of man. Because if a science or a technology is good or bad, that is not defined by the technology, but it is defined by man if he is of evil or if he is for the good. Now, an aesthetically educated man in the tradition of the great German classical period of Schiller, of Beethoven, of Dante, and many other towering figures would never use technologies for a bad aim. So the problem is not science and technology, it is the lack of the cultural development of human beings. Now, I'm convinced that while we look at the possible extinction of civilization, that if we get our act together now, we could also be the authors of a new era of mankind. That we could build a true renaissance where we leave oligarchism as a childhood disease behind us, never to come back. Why don't we go for that?
Well, I think with Helga's remarks, we have a very good start for the discussion tonight. And I would actually encourage people to reflect about this when still sending in their comments and questions, because Mrs. Larouche gave us quite a lot to go through. Now, I want to start because I do think it is important to recognize where we are strategically. And you have, Helga, addressed very clearly the war danger and also the magnitude when you discuss the kinds of weaponry that would be deployed in such a war. And I think it's important, therefore, to just be clear where we are. And so I want to start with two questions that have reached us on this question of war. One reflecting pretty much an axiom that we meet many, many times in organizing. This question is from Germany, and it says, don't you think that those who threaten this world war might not have some kind of refuge on or maybe even under the earth, a quasi-second Venice, and could that not be the reason for them to freely risk the danger of a world war, because they would be the ones who would outlive it? And then another question where the questioner says that no army on this planet could actually fulfill its real task when a nuclear war would break out, namely to protect their own population and infrastructure from destruction. So that in itself should be enough to call on all politicians to rethink their current approach. And if they can't, then they should be removed from offices of power. And this questioner then asks, is it not a possibility, because the proposal is also supported by Iran, to turn the Middle East or Southwest Asia into a nuclear war-free zone?
Well, concerning the first question, I think while I have no detailed knowledge about such questions, I know, however, from past discussions that some of the top oligarchs have bunkers. There are some houses in, I was told, Acapulco and Australia and other places where you have houses which have 1 story above ground and 9 stories below ground, and obviously some people think that they can survive even a thermonuclear war. Now, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if these people would be very happy to live in a world blasted by nuclear radiation for a long time to come. I don't know. I mean, I don't rule it out. I unfortunately don't rule it out. There are many buildings which have bunker parts. Even in Paris, I know of such buildings. But I think, it is not something, I think we need to act before it comes to that. But I don't put it behind people, unfortunately not. Now, concerning the second question, I think you are quite right, that the purpose of the army in a sovereign nation state should be exactly that: protect the population, protect the infrastructure. But what we have seen increasingly with the emergence of this empire idea was actually laid out by Samuel Huntington in his infamous book, The Soldier and the State, where he describes over 800 pages, which I tortured myself once to read, how the army, which is supposed to be based on Carnot or the German Bundeswehr innere Führung concept, the tradition of the Prussian reformers, should be eliminated by mercenary armies modeled on the Roman Empire, the imperial army, where the purpose of the soldier is no longer to be connected to its own people, but to basically, be a mercenary. Do not think about political things, just follow orders, increase the killing ratio, and that kind of soldier has been groomed, unfortunately, a lot since the Second World War through the development of video games, Counter-Strike, Doom, killing, basically without any human reflection. And unfortunately, if you look at the armies being deployed in Iraq, Afghanistan, and who knows, Libya, where else, a lot of this has been outsourced, privatized to private security firms, which are no longer accountable to parliaments. And I unfortunately see a tendency also in that direction in Germany with the abandoning of the draft army, which the Lügenbaron Dr. Gutenberg has donated us, not as the only one, but he made the final stone to this. Unfortunately, it's going in this direction. The training of the soldier to be an example, like the officer who has the Auftragstaktik capability, so that if his battalion or whatever gets somehow lost from the general army, he would know exactly what is the strategic plan of the generals because he is a thinking person. That has been completely eliminated. And it's a very bad development, and I think we should eventually reverse it, because these imperial armies, these so-called intervention forces for human rights purposes, that is part of the empire. Now, concerning the idea of turning the Middle East into a nuclear-free zone, absolutely, but I would take it a step further. I think we should get rid of nuclear weapons altogether. I think that the time to solve any conflict on this planet with weapons is outdated and can only lead to the consequences I was talking about earlier. I think we must move in a completely different direction, pick up on the proposal of, I think it was attributed to Rogozin, of a strategic defense of the Earth, where the countries work together to fight off galactic threats, like asteroids which could destroy the planet or other such things, and make nuclear weapons obsolete in the same way like Lyndon LaRouche already proposed it with the SDI in the period of the Reagan administration, using these weapon systems based on new physical principles to solve other problems, use them in the civilian economy, get a science driver going, eliminate poverty on the planet. I think we have to make the next step, because if we don't make the next step, we may not make it as a species. So I think the strategic defense of the Earth should be put on the agenda, and an abolition of nuclear weapons all over the planet.
When it comes to the danger of civil unrest, but also just simply collapse in Europe, which is Greece, a question has reached us from an associate professor at the University of the Aegean, and he details a little bit that the poverty rate in Greece, as you have mentioned already before, is at 28%. Unemployment is over 20%, and I can add among the youth it's over 50%. He says there's a very problematic administration. Greece is drifting into real chaos by a distant and barbaric administration. Most of the EU funding, he continues, has been distributed during the past 30 years in a very problematic way under the blessing of EU administration. That created inflation, it created black markets and capital outflows from Greece. This situation is a failure of the EU administration over the past 30 years. The general interest was never allowed to develop. There's only private for-profit development in health and education and utilities. We're dealing with corrupt and inadequate local government while social institutions are in complete atrophy. So he raises the question, what alternatives are there for the Greek people now after years of near depression?
Well, I think that Greece has no other chance than to leave the euro, to re-establish sovereign control over its own currency and economy. And I think that since the whole world should be interested that Greece is not going into a catastrophe, with the new Greek economic system, immediate economic treaties should be made with Germany, with Russia, which has a high interest in the help of Greece anyway, with China, which has invested in Greece, and then put a completely different development perspective on the table. I mean, all the proposals by the EU do not mention the creation of jobs, the building of industries. And obviously, if you squeeze a lemon, you can only squeeze it to a point and then it's empty. And if you don't go for a complete build-up of the economy, then it cannot function. So what you need to do is to have a development perspective, but I think it would be only possible in the context of the building of the Eurasian land bridge. We need a kind of Marshall Plan. I don't like to use the word Marshall Plan because it has a bad connotation with Marshall, but it's an image that we take the entire region of the southern Europe, parts of Turkey, Greece, Cyprus, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and build up this region in the context of the infrastructure corridors coming from the Eurasian integration, through such corridors. Build maglev trains, build real industry. Greece should pick a couple of industries where it has the ambition to become the avant-garde on a worldwide scale. Make an incentive for the 50% unemployed engineers to stay in the country, to get jobs in these industries. Call back the other educated people who already have left the Greece because they don't see a future there. And then build Eurasian land bridge through Egypt into Africa, through Sicily, a bridge or tunnel from Sicily to Tunisia or Morocco, build the Eurasian land bridge through the Strait of Gibraltar, and that way you overcome the underdevelopment of the Mezzogiorno, because the Mezzogiorno is de facto equally underdeveloped. It's only the north of Italy which is developed. Spain, apart from the real estate bubble, has almost no industries, the same for Portugal. And then use that development of Southern Europe with the development of a crash program for Africa. I mean, this is one thing I could have mentioned earlier, but let me do it now. I mean, if you have Europe, Europe does not have to be an empire to, make its, to defend its position. It doesn't have to use drones to keep refugees running away from hunger and disease in Africa. If Europe would decide to be an alliance of sovereign republics, we could take it as our mission to develop the African continent. Right now, Africa is threatened with, you have the hunger crisis at the Horn of Africa, Eastern Africa. Now you have a new crisis of 13 million people about to die in the western parts. Now, why don't we use this crisis to say we stop colonialism in Africa and we work together with the countries of the African continent to build up Africa to be livable for all the people who are there. In that case, the whole Mediterranean region, including Greece, would be like the jump start or the place from which this development could take off. And I think we have to think about transforming the entire region, not only the Mediterranean, Africa, but also the Middle East. Mr. LaRouche has made it a point since 1975 with his famous Oasis plan that the only way how you can have peace between Israel and the Palestinians, how you can settle the Afghanistan problem or Pakistan, that you have to look at the region as a whole, from the North Caucasus all the way Iran, Iraq, the Gulf states, Syria, Israel, Egypt, the Maghreb, that you take this region as a whole and go for a real industrialization program. Because only if you put in a development perspective, which makes it more interesting for all the parties which have had wars for ages, to work together for the benefit of all, that you can hope to settle these historical, ethnic, religious and other conflicts. If it is clear that there is a joint commitment of Russia, China, Iran, India, Pakistan, to develop this region. Then you can solve problems like Afghanistan or other problems like the reconstruction of Iraq or the Israeli-Palestinian problem. If we don't do that, the world will blow up. Now, all the policies are there, and I think we should just do it. And I think Greece, the Greek problem, cannot be solved as an isolated problem. I think the train has left the station, so to speak, for that. I think we need to have a complete change of the agenda and go for a true transformation of the planet to make it habitable for all human beings on this planet.
Helga, this question is from a teacher and students at the MGIMO, the Russian Foreign Ministry University. They have held several seminars which studied video addresses by Lyndon LaRouche and the LaRouche PAC team on the topic of a credit system. The question is such: we watched your message from last September called "There is Life After the Euro." And we read the 7 policy points in your call for a worldwide Trennbankensystem, a worldwide separation of the banks, which was published in the press in Russia. More and more people in Russia believe that the next wave of the crisis is coming soon and will hit hard. Our Prime Minister, Vladimir Putin, has attacked the global bubble economy. Talking about the world economic crisis, he said the best case scenario is a rejection of bubble economies and the return to an economy of real value. Quote, an economy that creates jobs instead of derivatives. So they ask, what should the Russian government do now to make this happen on a really big scale? In 2011, capital flight out of Russia doubled. So should we use exchange controls? How can we get credit for investments in the real sector, and who in Europe would work with us on this?
Well, I think from what I have seen coming from recent speeches from Prime Minister Putin, President Medvedev, people like Rogozin and others, is that there is a definite commitment to undo the effects of the oligarchy or oligarchs from the 90s under the Yeltsin period and reinstate Russia as a leading industrial and scientific power. Mr. Rogozin was recently at the previously secret science city affirming that it will be reactivated. There were travels by Prime Minister Putin to the Far East, where he reaffirmed the building of the Bering Strait, the building of the Arctic development, and similar things. All of this is excellent. I only see one weak spot, and that is that I don't think that economists and politicians in Russia have completely broken with the idea of monetarism, because there were statements coming from some of these people saying, yeah, but we still need foreign investors to invest in these projects. Now, this will never happen, because this present financial system is about to go, either disintegration or hyperinflation. And it reflects also a wrong idea, because I don't know if it has to do with the fact that Karl Marx rejected Friedrich List at the time and Carey, and that there was not a real rethinking, because recently some Russian economists talked about restudying Adam Smith and Ricardo and whatnot. I think we have to have a complete recognition that any industrial development which took place in Europe, Russia, United States, came from the tradition of physical economy, and the proponents of that were Gottfried Leibniz, who invented this notion the first time when he developed the steam engine. It was carried, or before it was the development of the Colbert School in France. Friedrich List belongs to that school. And naturally Henry Carey, who was the advisor of Lincoln, who also was influential in causing Bismarck to turn from pro-feudal free market proponent into a believer of physical economy through the ideas of Henry Carey. Henry Carey was also, together with Friedrich List, the reason why the Meiji Restoration in Japan turned Japan from a completely isolated feudal country in a few decades into one of the leading industrial nations in the world. This was the same ideas of Count Witte, who was a complete fan of Friedrich List. He wrote beautiful things about this in his own books. So I think now my suggestion would be that there must be a real studying of what is physical economy, what is a credit system, and really understand that the power of the state to issue credit for future production, which leads to an increase in the productivity of the economy by injecting scientific and technological progress, is the source of wealth. In other words, it is the unique capability of human labor inspired by creative discoveries to create more than there was before. And that is why, for example, both Dr. Lautenbach in 1931 or the famous VTB plan, Wojtyński-Bade plan in the German trade union movement, they came up with the same idea. What Franklin D. Roosevelt's idea was the combination of Glass-Steagall and the New Deal. Get rid of the usurious, fictitious debt coming from the gambling, make an investment based on investment in the future through improvement of technological progress. And then a credit which you issue is not inflationary, because it's a credit in respect to future production. And indeed, the study of oil recovery programs prove that a credit given in such a way produces more tax revenues than the amount of the credit initially given, because it has a secondary effect. It puts into motion not only the direct investment, but everything in the surrounding. So it's like a science driver for the entire economy. And I think that would be my firmest advice, for Russian economists. Study this, and then maybe Russia could become one of the leading initiators of this transformation from a monetarist system to a credit system, which is the absolute indispensable prerequisite for getting out of this crisis.
Well, thank you. I think as questions are reaching us more, we're going to have to probably group them in a somewhat different way, but nevertheless, there's one that I would like to pose here, because it does focus on something that you have already brought up in your address. And I think it is something that people in Germany, but probably in many other countries in Europe, have on their minds. And it says the following: I would like to know what concrete and obviously very effective mechanisms is the British Empire using to force and threaten the governments of European states, especially Germany and France, to keep them from installing a Glass-Steagall system in the interest, obviously, of their own nations and others, and also to keep them from taking first steps toward building and setting up national banks in their respective nations. The question says, what would happen if Merkel and Sarkozy, either together or on their own, would actually demand this kind of policy step? And what is the kind of fear that keeps them from not doing this and instead follow the fascist machinations of the financial oligarchy? The fear of personal consequences of this shouldn't be that big, especially in light of the fact that the representatives of the financial oligarchy just are having their very own Waterloo. And then the interesting comment: I do not think that this is due to the lack of sovereignty of Germany, which sovereignty has not been really restored since 1945. because France and other European nations apparently are just as unable to act these days as Germany is.
Well, I think it has probably different elements which work together. I mean, first of all, you know, if people don't have a vision of the future, they just go along to get along. And I think that most politicians and most parties, they don't think in terms of what should be the aim of mankind 100 years from now, what should be the next step of the development of civilization, but they think how to maintain their position until the next election. I have met politicians who say, oh yeah, I'm for the common good, but not so much that it would threaten my career. I think that element to go along, get along, move up in your environment, that for sure is a big element. I think what comes together with that is naturally the fact that when you have an individual who tends to step out of the mainstream and, you know, think about the people and the civilization in large, like Alfred Herrhausen is a good example. Alfred Herrhausen in 1998 or 89 was supposed to make a speech in New York in December, where he was about to propose the development of Poland outside of the IMF using the model of the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau in the post-war period. And Herrhausen had, you know, angered the oligarchy before when he proposed a general debt cancellation for third world countries. Well, he was killed before he ever could make that speech. And that generally was understood in the dramatic circumstances of German unification as a clear warning to Kohl to not step out of the present system of the IMF and similar institutions. And if you look at the number of assassinations of the so-called RAF, Red Army faction, they all targeted key individuals of the nuclear industry or some other basic industries of Germany and other countries. The same happened in Italy with Mattei, you know, basically a lot of such murders occurred. So I think there is always this idea that you get rid of people who have the courage to speak, you know, for such ideas. But I think the main problem, you know, right now, for example, it was our own presidential candidate, Jacques Cheminade, who has shaped our own, I mean, in spirit, our own, who is now a full-fledged presidential candidate in France, has shaped the debate for Glass-Steagall. The French socialist candidate Hollande has come out for a separation of the banks. Even Gabriel from the SPD is now for a separation of the banks, even if he still is for Eurobonds and has obviously not thought this thing through, that you can't have the two because they belong to two completely different universes or realms of thinking. But I think now Mrs. Merkel says she is campaigning for Sarkozy. Now the French are really, you know, between a rock and a hard place if they should laugh about that or say, in any case, they think it's a big mistake. In all likelihood, Sarkozy will lose the election and Mrs. Merkel will have bet on the wrong horse. And, you know, Sarkozy unfortunately stands for the maintenance of this system. And this system cannot be kept. So I think it is a mixture of all of these things. I think it's a somehow axiomatic desire to keep the world as it is, to stick with the axioms, to be part of the privileged class, to not risk anything. And it's a lack of education, frankly. I mean, I don't know why people think that Mrs. Merkel is a natural scientist, because she has shown absolutely no understanding of physical economy. She doesn't know anything about energy, otherwise she wouldn't have pushed this ridiculous exit from nuclear energy. I don't know what is wrong with her, but something is wrong with her, I can assure you. I think the key problem is that people don't have a vision where to go. We have one. We want to have a world where every human being on this planet can have a life in dignity, not only on the planet, but soon on other planets. If you have that vision, then you think completely different. And that is the best I can think.
We have gotten, in the meantime, one comment also from Austria. I think the question that the questioner asked, in a sense, has been answered already in the address. She nevertheless says, "Thank you very much for your extraordinary speech." And she's hoping that Büsow has a dépendance or partners in Austria. But since you mentioned Jacques Cheminade, I wanted to bring this question up because it's also a good opportunity to talk about this. A question that has reached us earlier. What do you think is the outlook for the presidential election in France, where our friend Jacques Cheminade is running as a candidate? In the media here, you're already only presented with two candidates, namely Sarkozy and François Hollande. And Hollande, he says, also somehow seems strangely pro-British. And of the other candidates, we don't need to talk because none of them actually has reached the necessary support of these 500 officials. He says it would be very good if there were only three candidates left, and Cheminade would have a very good chance to become president of France, because then he could read Mrs. Merkel the Riot Act. So I might pose that as a question, and just because it's of a similar nature in a way, a comment of someone who says, those who are rich will try everything to maintain their system. I see this kind of contrast in South Africa, where you are confronted with poverty on the one side, and on the other you have walled-in people with security service and so forth, the rich ones, and those will never accept this kind of radical change. What is your opinion about that?
Well, I mean, first concerning Jacques' campaign, well, I think it's a very interesting situation, because he obviously has gained the trust of the elected officials who have given him their signature, because they recognize that what he said in '95, when he already was running for president once, warning of the financial system to collapse, and now he's campaigning with the slogan "World Free of the City and Wall Street," that he represents the interest of the French population, and others don't. I mean, I asked him the other day, why is it that you have the signatures and, for example, Marine Le Pen from the Front National has not? And he said, well, it's the arrogance of some of these candidates who send out questionnaires to the mayors saying, are you willing to sign? And the mayors who are fighting an existential fight, you know, for their community, for the farmers, for the communes they represent, they don't want to be treated as answering machines or just, you know, some mechanical deal. While, you know, we have been organizing these mayors for the larger ideas we represent since years. So some of these people have been following us for years. They have understood that you do not get out of this present crisis with a gimmick, with some little cosmetic solution, you know, a little dot on your beauty problem, but that you need a real fundamental change of the system, which goes into very deep epistemological, ontological questions of man and nature. And so therefore I think we are at a point, I mean, the French election is still 2 months away. Now that means we have a lot of crises. For example, the month of February, you will have an explosion of liquidity pumping. The European banks have asked another 1 trillion euro to keep afloat only in February. So they start printing the trillions now. Why not 5 trillion? They want to have 5 trillions for the rest of the year. Why not 10 trillion, 20 trillion? It will soon come to that if nothing is changed. So then, beginning of March, there will be the Russian election, which I think will be also very significant because you will have definite efforts by this destabilization apparatus I mentioned earlier to try to cause dissension there. Interestingly, the Greenies in Germany are fully part of that. Trittin and others, they just had an event in the Bundestag calling for an Arab Spring in Russia, fitting with their oligarchical profile completely. Then you have the new report of the International Atomic Energy Agency supposed to come out at the beginning of March, and you can expect, around that an effort of the war party to increase the drumbeat for war. Then you have the entire March, and you have 3 weeks in April. So with this system, the euro collapsing, I think the world can look completely different in 2 months from now. So under normal circumstances, I think Jacques, has not a chance to win. He's still in the 1-digit percentages. But with the developments in the next 2 months, everything can change. So let's hope for the best.
And maybe in that light, I just want to also pose this question. Somebody writes to us here that he says most of the theses that Büsow presents, I think, make sense. But what does a single person do with this kind of knowledge? For example, in trying to prevent a World War III, and then there are no elections nearing here. And if you're honest, your party, even in the near future, will only range in the 0.5%. How do we deal with that situation if election results usually are so little?
Well, I'm not worried that this will remain in such a way, because we are in such a absolutely dramatic moment in history that, for example, we would have had World War III already in all likelihood if my husband would not have warned of exactly that danger end of October, which at that time caused a lot of consternation and people were quite upset about it. But in the meantime, a lot of people in influential positions have expressed the same concern. Among them, a lot of the Israeli opposition, among them some of the leading American military men, both in duty as well as retired, who have expressed a concern and have made clear that this must not be the road to go. The whole situation is really so tense that I think dramatic changes can happen. And I think that the question in a period like that, when an old order is disintegrating, it's not so much that you have to be the numbers at least not in the beginning, but much more important is, do you express those ideas which address themselves to the fundamental inherent mistake of that present order, and do you have a vision where to go next? And I feel not exactly but I feel remembered of Nicolaus of Cues. Nicolaus of Cues, who wrote the Doctor Ignorantia in the 30s of the 15th century, and he wrote consciously, I'm writing things which no other human being has ever thought before. And I know I'm writing for a new epoch of history. And in the same way, I think that what the movement which I'm a part of is representing is the kind of force whose ideas will shape the future of civilization. And then you can have sudden jumps and sudden developments. And I think that then, if the Büsow remains at low percentage and we will not be successful, I don't think we have much to worry about, because we may not be long for this world. I'm an optimist. I plan to do the opposite. And in that case, I believe that what we have to say, especially in terms of returning Germany to a science driver country, after all, Germany used to be the country of poets, thinkers and inventors. And if you look at the great discoveries, which make modern knowledge, how many of these have come from Germany? I don't want to become, overly proud or, arrogant, but given the fact that the Germans have become so little, let me be a little bit proud. Think of all the many thinkers in science, in music, in poetry. Almost every faculty existing in universities today has been invented by a German. I'm exaggerating a little bit because I'm coming from Trier, where people always like to say things in a very dramatic way. But it's true, we have this incredibly proud tradition, and it is eminently accessible for everybody who wants to open a book or go to the library or go into a laboratory. These things are accessible. Many of these things have been written in German. To go back to Schiller, you don't have to translate it, you can read it in the original. If you want to read Kepler, almost 1/3 of Leibniz is in German, because he also wrote in French and Latin in one sentence, but makes it a little bit more difficult to read. But many of these things are easily accessible, and I think we are in front of such an absolutely dramatic change of the era, that if mankind makes it, and that's a matter of this year, I'm convinced of it, then you will have a sudden recognition that all the paradigms associated with globalization and monetarism, counterculture, that all of this was crap and a waste of time, and that there will be an incredible thirst for true knowledge. And I think that we can have a renaissance. I'm absolutely certain that we can make a renaissance in the same way like we made the Italian Renaissance after the Dark Age of the 14th century, because we have studied how to do it. We know where are the scientific and cultural treasures to go to, how to revive them. And I think that even in Germany, I'm in politics because I believe that the German people have a tremendous potential to again play a role like in the spirit of Friedrich Schiller, of Beethoven and similar minds, and help the advancement of mankind. And I think if we can present these ideas, especially to young people, I think they will reject all of this counterculture which has turned them into slaves. And I think we can have a good future also for Germany and for the BÜSO.
Helga, I think this is no big secret that our current Chancellor Merkel is not exactly making friends in Europe, since she is working, so to speak, as the acting hand of an imperial structure. Now, among the things that you have just mentioned as contributions of Germany in the past, I think one of these people is a little bit more tricky to access, if I remember certain presentations that you gave about Bismarck in the past before. But I think this may be a good point to also say something about that tradition, because the policy that Angela Merkel represents today is not a German policy, and it's also not really in the German interest at all. So could you please say something about Bismarck's policy of a European cooperation and the development of nations as we plan to do it today from a different and new economic platform?
Well, I have said many times that I wish Germany would have been unified not by Bismarck but by Freiherr vom Stein and Wilhelm von Humboldt, which I think were the even higher statesmen than Bismarck, because Freiherr vom Stein and Wilhelm von Humboldt, who after Germany won the liberation war against Napoleon, already in the Russian campaign, where the German Prussian reformers had advised the Russian military how to defeat Napoleon, they had worked out a memorandum how to unify Germany as a constitutional state. And with that idea, they went to the Congress of Vienna and had the right to expect that German unification as a constitutional monarchy, but as a constitutional monarchy, would be the result. Now, this was outmaneuvered by Metternich and every other oligarch at the Congress of Vienna, but that would have been the true spirit of Friedrich Schiller in the best way, which Bismarck also had, but let's say he was a little bit more of a Junker at the same time. Now, Bismarck, however, made a tremendous transformation. When he became chancellor, he still was believing in free market economy, in free trade, in the interest of the Junker class of his time. But then, as I mentioned earlier, he, mainly through the writings of von Kardorff, who was the equivalent of the boss of the Industry Association at that time, he wrote a little booklet called Against the Stream, Against the Mainstream, in which von Kardorff develops how he encountered the writings of Henry C. Carey through various acquaintances and so forth. And then he started to recognize how the theory of the British free trade, that free trade is the only guarantee for wealth, was a complete fraud, especially because the British also did not follow it. They only wanted others to follow it while they kept a certain amount of protectionism themselves. And then Kardorff develops this idea how the countries who follow protectionist policies blossomed, like France, and that the theory behind it is that the only source of wealth is the increase in the creativity of the own population. And for that, you need a protected domestic market, you need investment in science and technology and education. And Bismarck then made a couple of very interesting speeches in the parliament at the time, where he clearly referred to this. Now, the funny thing is that in all the history books, all the biographies about Bismarck, you do not find one word about this. It's quite a phenomenon. You do not find references to von Kardorff, even if he is the present equivalent, or the equivalent of the present BDI or DIHK. And one would hope that some of these industrialists would read von Kardorff, would read Bismarck, who most of them admire, and they would find out that it was Bismarck's using of the economic theory of Lincoln and Carey which transformed Germany from a feudal country into an industrial nation in a very short period of time. Now, Bismarck obviously was extremely crucial for Germany, also because he was very intelligent as a diplomat. He had a very, very elaborated network of diplomatic treaties with all European nations, especially the famous Rückversicherungsvertrag with Russia, which meant basically that after the war with France, he wanted to make sure that in case of a new war between Germany and France, that Russia would remain neutral. Now, that was the main reason why Edward VII, or previously the Prince of Wales, and the British Empire did everything possible to get the emperor, the Kaiser, to kick Bismarck out, because they knew that as long as Bismarck was in this position, that he would keep Germany secure and strong. So I think going back to this period and studying it, for today's people in statescraft, one could only wish that they would look at the Prussian reformers, that they would look at Freiherr vom Stein, Wilhelm von Humboldt, who after all with the Humboldt education reform caused a complete change in the education system by defining as the goal of education the beauty of the character. I think in the present utilitarian idea of education, bachelor's and master's degrees, and total utilitarian transformation of education, to go back to Humboldt and say it's the method how to learn, it's the ennoblement of the character, which is the aim of education. That is more needed than anything else. So I think if Mrs. Merkel who will probably not be long chancellor in any case, and others, would go back to these Vorbilder, these ideals, I think we would be in much better shape to have people in leading positions who are educated in the best tradition of German culture and German history.
This year, 2012, also marks the 300th anniversary of the birth of Frederick II, or Frederick the Great as he's known. And as part of that, I recently actually saw what you have just described as the kind of change that has happened here. And if you actually do this consciously and look at how what kind of leaps have been made, I mean, in Germany as well as in the United States, going from the 18th to the 20th century, it shouldn't actually be so hard to imagine a world that is entirely different again from today's. For instance, in talking about a moon or a Mars program. Now, I want to ask a question that has reached us, I have no idea how many times, but many, many times, which basically is of the same shape wherever you meet it. People will ask, well, we do have enough problems down here, so why do we have to go to moon? Why do we have to go to Mars? And in that same light, I might ask as the counterpoint to that question, you already indicated something about the oligarchical nature of the green movement. So maybe you can combine that a little bit, because it appears from that perspective of a very fascinating and inspiring development of Germany. The green tendency seems to represent everything that is opposite to that. So maybe you can address that as well.
Well, I think this idea of conservation, that you have to save energy, you have to conserve limited resources, that belongs to a universe which is not the real universe, but it has been brainwashed. I remember because we had ideas about the development of Africa and other parts of the world already at the beginning of the 70s. As a matter of fact, that was why I joined Mr. Larouche, who was not my husband at that time, but why I joined his movement, because I came back from a trip which had shortly led me also to Africa and China and some Asian countries. And I came back from this trip with the absolute commitment that the condition of especially the developing sector, was such that it could not remain, because there are poverty, unnecessary, terrible condition of life required a development program, which Mr. Larouche was proposing already at that time. And I thought, that is it, that's what I want to devote my life to. So therefore, I had already an idea how to develop Africa at the beginning of the 70s. And therefore, when the oligarchy decided to go for a complete paradigm shift with the absolute intentional idea to eliminate cultural optimism, to eliminate the ideas associated with the Apollo program of John F. Kennedy, for example, where people were absolutely convinced that you can solve any problem with science and technology, where if you would ask young people, what do you want to become when you grow up, they would say, I want to become an astronomer, I want to go, I want to fly my dog in space like Laika. They would have all kinds of optimistic ideas. They wanted to eradicate that and impose cultural pessimism. And that was why you had, at the beginning of the 70s, from MIT, Forrester, and Meadows, why you had the Club of Rome, all of a sudden saying limits to growth. Until now, maybe the world developed, but now we have reached this equilibrium, and now in a closed system we have to deal with limited resources and conserve nature and all of these things. Now that obviously is a complete lie, and Meadows and Forrester later admitted that they had pre-programmed their computer model with the end result being there in the beginning and then reprogramming in such a way that that result was there. And that they had committed a complete intellectual fraud by leaving out the role of science and technology to determine what is a resource. Now, if you do that, then naturally it's a complete fraud, because, you know, you can take a piece of stone, and if you are in the Stone Age, you can take that stone and hit your neighbor and kill him, or you can take this stone and say, oh, this stone has the following interesting minerals, ores, and I can use it for the following productions if I treat it in a following way. And naturally, you know, what a resource is completely determined by the level of technology with which you treat this. For example, with modern thermonuclear fusion power, you can basically take garbage and turn it back into new isotopes for production, for all kinds of things. So in other words, once you make a new leap, you reach new resources. And Meadows and Forrester completely, you know, left that out, committing a fraud. And at that time, the Club of Rome put out this book and similar studies, millions of dollars in all languages. Simultaneously, they threw this garbage all over the planet. And naturally, you know, I mean, I was at the beginning of this transformation, because I went to the UN Population Conference in 1974 with a clear plan for the development of Africa. And, you know, at that point, there was Rockefeller III, who was chairing the NGO part of the conference, and he laid out a completely disgusting proposal of sustainable development, of renewable resources, that population growth is the biggest threat to civilization. And at that time, nobody believed him. As a matter of fact, all the NGOs and the left groups which were there, they said, population growth, that is a Rockefeller baby. It's a myth invented by the Rockefeller Foundation for their own interest, because they were not brainwashed yet at that time. Now, since that, 74, you almost have 35 years or 37 years have passed. And if you think about all the different scare stories about anthropogenic climate change, now people believe that. You know, the reality is that the CO2 emission, which comes from human productivity, is so negligible that you could have a little fly sitting on an elephant, scratching the elephant, and the elephant wouldn't even notice. The real changes in the climate obviously come from the cyclical developments of our galaxy, of sun activities, which, you know, a year ago when we started our weather reports, you know, people said, this is ridiculous, you know, galactic weather, sun influencing the weather. They completely poo-pooed it. In the meantime, Bild Zeitung says new storms on the sun affecting our weather. So, you know, you can see how in 1 year our consistent pushing a certain idea has become a normal idea, you know, which shows you the power of ideas if these ideas are right and if these ideas intersect a moment of crisis. Now, I want to take back this greenie problem, because the greenie problem today, and you have unfortunately a complete greenization of the brains of all parties in Germany. It's not just the Green Party, but it's all parties. All parties have become green. Now, that is why the BÜSO is so absolutely crucial, because we are not, and we have never made a compromise with that. Among other things, because we understand what is the real physical universe and why this notion of Gaia is absurd. Prince Philip at one point said that, he said that at a public conference, that we have to go back to the pre-Christian mythologies of Gaia and other cyclical ideas, because only these mythologies allow for the population reduction which are desirable, while Christianity does not. So it's clear what the intention is behind. And, you know, when I came across this green problem for the first time, I started to look at where it comes from. And there is a very interesting book by from the Siemens Foundation called Conservative Revolution, which people should read because it's a real interesting story, which traces back correctly the idea of conservation of nature to an oligarchical counter-deployment against the so-called ideas of 1789, meaning on the one side naturally the ideas of the French Revolution, but also meaning the ideas of the American Revolution, because 1789 was not only the crucial year for France, but it was also the year where George Washington moved into the White House for the first time. And at that time, the entire oligarchy of Europe and the United States decided to try to roll back the principles of the American Revolution, which had been established, in the War of Independence, and which are expressed in the American Constitution and in the Declaration of Independence, namely that every human being has the right for life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, which means a fulfilled life. That's what pursuit of happiness really means. So they decided to have this idea of the conservative revolution, conserve the values of the feudal society before these changes, and basically go back to these cultural pessimistic ideas of the eternal return of the same, which was then later pushed by Nietzsche and which directly led to the ideology of the Nazis. Now, if you trace back these conservative revolution movements, of which there were 400, they lived on in the youth movement before World War I, the glorification of nature. They lived through the First World War, expressed by such people as Ernst Jünger, who is a representative of the continuation of this tradition. And, it was exactly going back to these ideas, which after all also flourished in the Third Reich. And that is really what it is. It is this idea of an oligarchical order, of limited resources, of conservation of energy, of low energy flux densities, and low population. And, if you ask a Greenie, are you for development aid? You have a very high chance that he says, oh no, if we give development aid to the third world, it just means they multiply more. I mean, that's an answer I have gotten repeatedly, and it just shows you the cynicism of these people. And it does not surprise me at all that the Greenies are now instrumental, together with Golos, together with the same apparatus of George Soros, in the attempt to destabilize Putin in the coming election, as they had demonstrated in their recent event in the Bundestag. So they are part and piece of parcel of the oligarchical system. They are what the machine troopers, Maschinenstürmer were at a certain point. And, it happens to be that in Germany they also became the party of the best earning, people being rich, profiting from this trend. We have, demonstrated and documented that the hedge funds like Greenies. The reason is that there is now a big profit in CO2 emission trade, in investment in solar parks, in wind energy. And I can only say this is the wrong way for Germany to go. And already now, it was mentioned at the recent DIHK conference that already 20% of the German Mittelstand have either left Germany or are planning to do so, because the combination of energy insecurity, which is threatening some industries who cannot take any vacillation whatsoever, and the increase of energy prices simply mean that Germany as a location for industry is no longer attractive. So if Germany wants to survive as an industrial and scientific power, let's get rid of the Greenies.
On that same issue, there was in the former German Democratic Republic in East Germany, there was a very well-known series of jokes involving a radio station called Radio Erevan. And once the question was asked to Radio Erevan, is it true that the United States and NATO have developed a new super weapon that could bring down all of the Soviet Union and their allies within a single day? And the answer was principally yes. But why make such a big effort if 10 centimeters of snow would do the same job? Now, I'm saying that because as part of what you have addressed now with the sun actually driving the climate, this should really be a call to those people who know that we have led this campaign for a long time to wake up and see that these things can change very quickly, also in public perception. But one question that has reached us from one of our activists in Baden-Württemberg in the southwest of Germany says that the last couple of weeks, and we're all aware of that, have been extremely cold all over the northern hemisphere from the Atlantic to the Pacific region. And this is a phenomenon that struck about 36 countries in Europe and Asia who have been badly surprised by the effects of this wave of extreme cold weather. Ironically, this extreme weather pattern seems to be essentially due to our very powerful sun and not to global warming, as is ridiculously repeated in the mainstream media. Isn't that a sign that if we succeed in stopping the war danger, that we have an ever greater problem with the green policy? I think you answered that already. A danger is so big that it could wipe out Europe, resulting, for instance, from the shutting down of nuclear power. And I might just add to that question, because it goes in the same direction, the problem of food supply, which I think has been equally destroyed as the energy supply, maybe even worse. With what's coming up now, as your husband, Linda LaRouche, has already warned, with the coming spring in the United States, but obviously in many other countries. So if you could address these questions as well.
Well, I think it is very, very clear that greenism, the environmental policy, is simply, belonging to a kind of thinking which does not allow for mankind to continue to progress. It is very clear that even if the Greenies naturally would not, at least not publicly say so, that if you go to energy flux density of wind and solar energy, or the even more insane idea of Mr. Schellenhuber of the advisory board to the German government, who proposes in his paper The Great Transformation, the so-called decarbonization of the world economy by proposing not only to get rid of nuclear energy but also gas, oil, and just go for go for solar and wind power, that energy flux density is only sufficient for maybe 1 billion, at most 2 billion people, and that is questionable. Now, if you ask then the question, who should decide who are the people who should vanish? Well, maybe Mr. Schellenhuber should be the first one to disappear and help mankind, to solve this problem. But that's obviously a joke, or at least an attempt to joke. But, obviously these people who are pushing these policies clearly want to reduce the world population. And, if you look at the present EU policy towards Africa, it is very clear that behind that is the policy of Cecil Rhodes. They may not say it, but it is de facto so. Cecil Rhodes, who at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century had the idea to depopulate Africa from black people, to have only white, landowners sitting on their large mansions overlooking beautiful lakes and keeping a couple of black slaves around for their service, that policy is more or less what is still on the agenda, because the EU goes to African countries and talks about good governance. Before you can have any credit, have good governance. Cut your payments for your social service, cut your investment in education systems, pay back your debt, reduce the living standard, pay back your debt. And, fortunately China is there, and they say, okay, we go to Africa and we go for not sermons on Sunday, but we give hard business deals. We want your raw materials, but we give you infrastructure development instead. And I have not met one African who does not prefer that kind of a policy to the Germans of the EU. Now, obviously, that is not the solution, and you know, we need real African development, because the continent is in absolute danger to really die, even despite of these investments. But I think, you know, the correlation of energy flux density and population potential is a clearly demonstrable policy. And whoever says, let's go to wind and solar, or even the absurdity, build desert tech in the Sahara and then have gigantic cables to bring that solar energy to Europe, I mean, this is just a complete bestial world outlook. So I think that the necessary question is, you know, that we should really have an education campaign. Why is it that, for example, all nations, including Japan, including China, including Russia, after the events of Fukushima, drew completely different conclusions, namely that it was important to be more rigorous, because Fukushima was not a catastrophe of nuclear energy, it was a failure of construction. If there would have been a certain barrier just 2 meters higher, nothing would have happened. If they would have put aggregates into the on the ceiling instead of the basement. So it was a mechanical problem. And the only conclusion which Russia, China, Japan, Korea and other nations drew out of Fukushima was to say, okay, if there are some problems with these ancient light water reactors, then let's go for a crash program for inherently secure high temperature reactors, of the fourth generation of the thorium cycle. These are reactors who have a physical principle which shuts them down at the slightest problem. And let's go for the next higher energy flux density, which is thermonuclear fusion power. Now, I think we need a rethinking. I think that the consequences of the energy exit conducted by the Merkel government, which are already visible now, I mentioned the 20% of Mittelstand leaving the country, I think people will start to rethink that. And I think we need a rational debate, you know, what is the principle of energy flux density? Why is an increase of energy flux density absolutely crucial for the long-term survival of civilization? And I think the work which my husband started to do with the basement in recent period, where we put out tremendous documentations about what is the law of the real physical universe in terms of these anti-entropic developments, which you can prove through the existing fossils, through the existing traces in geophysical terms. I think that that is an argument which will revolutionize the entire natural science. It will do it in other countries, and if Germany doesn't want to totally drop out of the community of scientifically oriented countries, it better rises up to these developments.
Well, Helga, since you are in the United States right now, which I think is probably good news for the United States, it does bring up a question that, well, around an issue that has been a little bit handled with silence in the last couple of weeks, which I think is partly due to people becoming conscious that what they had hoped to be a positive change away from the catastrophe that was Bush and Cheney to Obama turned out not to be what they expected. Now, I would just like to ask you briefly, and I think a lot of people do have it in mind, what is happening in the United States? The Republican candidates, at least what you hear about them here in the German media, maybe all over Europe, really sounds catastrophic. But Obama, unfortunately, doesn't sound much better. So since a part of the recovery effort that your husband has undertaken for the last, at least for the last decades, involved a strong cooperation between the United States, Russia, and China, what role does the United States play in that, and what is the perspective of that actually happening over there in the U.S.?
Well, there is a unfortunate belated recognition that our estimate of what the Obama administration would be was correct, and that all the people who believed that Obama was the great messiahs who would cause change and all of these things were wrong, is now becoming a common understanding. There were people who drew up all the violations of the American Constitution committed by the Obama administration, ranging from the terrible health care reform, which is a kind of a triage system, to undeclared wars of aggression, like in the case of Libya, which was not okayed by the Congress, which after the Constitution would have had to happen, to the targeted assassination of people around the world. I think since January 2009, the United States has engaged in more than 4,500 targeted killings with drones and other means, including American citizens. The illegal detention of people without due legal process, the kidnapping of people into foreign countries, all of this is going on, and people have recognized this is everything Obama campaigned for against in his election campaign in 2008. And he is now doing the same thing what Bush and Cheney did, even more of the same. Even Cheney came out in a talk show recently and said, "Oh, I congratulate Obama, because he's doing much better than Bush and I," and he admitted it. Now, there is right now a complete paralysis in the United States, because while my husband has demanded since quite some time that the only way how you can stop World War III is by making an impeachment procedure against Obama. Now, I should explain that, because you see the problem which people in Europe don't consider. They think Obama is the president of the United States, and formally that's for sure true. But the war policy comes not from the United States, it comes from the British Empire. It goes back to Blair, it goes back to the present policy. If you look at all the different steps, it comes from the British government on the one side and the British Empire more generally, in the way I defined it as primarily the city of London and Wall Street. And if Obama would be impeached for the things he definitely has committed, then the war would not function, simply because the British alone are not able to carry out World War III. They need the American muscle. Now, if you would at this point get Obama out of office through an orderly impeachment procedure or some other paragraph of the American Constitution, Article 25, you would completely block this ongoing drive to war, which is very, very fast, and it's building up very, very quickly. Now, because people, except a few, are too coward to do that, now the Democrats say, "Oh, look at these Republicans, aren't they horrible?" And indeed they are. I mean, if you look at the selection of Republican candidates, they have the most crudest ideas, like Mitt Romney makes campaign against Europe. He was a Mormon missionary in France once and must have had some terrible experience. Now he condemns the Europeans every day. Others are having the most ludicrous ideas about the planet. So the Democrats basically say, look, let's capitulate and go for the re-election of Obama. Now, in a crisis like that, if you don't have a candidate who is able to address the most fundamental issues, and Obama has done all the steps in the opposite direction. He's canceling the manned space travel of NASA, which is insane. I mean, in this moment of galactic threats, you need to increase the research in volcanic precursor research, in earthquake research, in all of things which do need space travel. because otherwise you will never be able to put up the kinds of systems which would be a protection against that. So, if you have no candidate, neither the Republicans say, oh, we want to go to Mars, absolutely, but we don't want to change monetarism. We want to stick with Wall Street. We want to stick with private investment in space. Now, as one astronaut recently said, the idea of private investment for space travel to go to Mars, forget it. Because, private enterprise will always try to get the cheapest way. And you cannot have that in space travel. That's exactly why Kraft-Ericke talked about the extraterrestrial imperative. Because one positive side effect of this extraterrestrial imperative is that people have to behave according to physical laws. If you become a greenie or you become a dropout, a punk, in the middle of your space travel and you want to leave the spaceship, well, you do that one time and not a second time because, the physical principle does not agree with you. So you have to behave rational. And the very idea of the free market system, of free trade, of private investment is exactly against that. So there is no way how in this collapsing world system you will get with private investment to Mars or even the moon. So therefore, it's not only on that, but the present crop of candidates from, Obama to the Republicans simply means there is nobody to lead the United States at this grave moment out of the crisis. Now, there are a lot of people who like Ron Paul because at least he comes out against the war. It's a very good thing. It would be better if more people would do that. So he is to be lauded for that. But he believes in the Austrian school of economics, and that is a real problem. Because he does not believe in scientific principles governing the economy. He believes that everything should be left to the markets. He believes that the state should have no role in the determination. He even attacked Alexander Hamilton at one point. He's against Glass-Steagall. And that, unfortunately, means he's disqualified too, because if you don't go for Glass-Steagall as the absolute necessary first step, you cannot remedy this explosion of the system. So that is why we have run our own slate of candidates. We have 6 candidates for Congress right now who take up all of these issues as if they were presidential candidates. The idea is to have more such candidates, and you can see in the case of our famous taxi driver from Italy, Claudio Giudici, what one man can do in times of crisis, because Claudio Giudici has changed the dynamic in Italy completely by forcing the Glass-Steagall issue on the table. He was in national TV several times demanding Glass-Steagall. This is now being picked up by the former economic minister Tremonti, who is campaigning for Glass-Steagall in the tradition of Roosevelt. So between Jacques' campaign in France, the campaign for Glass-Steagall in Italy, which has now gotten a new boost because Senator Petalini has introduced an official bill for Glass-Steagall, and the work our own 6 candidate slate in the United States is doing, I think you can see the alternative leadership who, in a moment of crisis, could possibly bring the world out of this. So I think we are in an unbelievable situation because the United States could and should be the nation leading the rest of the world out of this crisis by going back to the Roosevelt tradition. But with this crop of candidates, it will not happen, which is why we are doing what we are doing.
Thank you very much. In some of the questions that have reached us in the meantime, I would suggest, since they come largely, I guess, from Germany and at least the German-speaking region here in Europe, that we reserve these maybe for the weekly audio podcast. But there's one question that I've kind of saved for the end because, in a way, even though it seems a very simple question, but I have a gut feeling that it really addresses a very fundamental question of personal identity. This is a supporter who says that he or she is very concerned about the developments in this world right now, and this is probably the case with many people, and asks also talks about that addressing these kinds of issues with family or friends is something that I have tried, but my experience is that people don't want to know about these things, they want to talk about it. And he says, I would support everything that I think would have some kind of a reasonable hope for success. I would be for doing whatever it takes. And so the concrete question is, for someone like me, who has very limited means at my disposal, what is necessary for me? What can I do personally to actually cause the necessary change? And we would just take this, I think, as the last question for tonight.
Well, I think the role of the individual in history is a very important question, because it has been emphasized by my husband many times, and everybody who has ever engaged in any kind of creative activity knows that creative mentation, creative activity is the role of one person. A poem is never being written by two people, simply because if you have a poetical idea or a musical idea, it is something which forms uniquely in your mind, solving, the idea of going to the next higher level, which is not in the prose. You have to form a gestalt which addresses this higher faculty, which, is what is new. Any progress is occurring in this way. And, that is something open to anybody. Just think about how many discoveries were made by such individuals, often being, in a social context, but sometimes also not, or being against the mainstream. So the individual creative development is something which is absolutely unique. However, you don't have to start from zero, because right now, I think the existence of our movement in the world, which started, well, it's hard to say, maybe it started in the beginning of the 50s, when Mr. Larouche discovered why the prevailing economic theories of von Wiener and Neumann, the statistical thinking, the whole information theory, why they were inherently incapable of addressing the nonlinear developments in the economy, probably was the beginning of this organization. And in the 50, 60 years since, we have become, I would say, a quite respected, recognized alternative to the present system of globalization. When you meet us for the first time, obviously you cannot know that, but we have proven many times that the power of ideas can change history. The most noteworthy examples was our collaboration with López Portillo, the president of Mexico, in defining Operation Juarez, which had Wall Street tremble for half an hour, fearing that a debtors cartel would form and it would be the end of Wall Street. Another extremely important example was the authorship of Mr. Larouche concerning the SDI, which after all was becoming official American policy, pronounced by Ronald Reagan on the 23rd of March in 1983, which led, among other things, to the collapse of the Soviet Union, not because it was intended in such a way, but because it was rejected by the Andropov government at that time. And Mr. Larouche in '84 predicted that if the Soviet policy would remain on that level, the Soviet Union would collapse in 5 years. Now, it did. And I can assure you, nobody at that point believed that to be true. But then it did happen, and that has led to a absolutely intense studying of the ideas of Mr. LaRouche, especially in Russia, because a lot of scientists, a lot of academicians, a lot of people said, how could Mr. LaRouche predict the collapse of the Soviet Union when everybody else was not able to do so? And Mr. LaRouche has a unique record of predicting economic crisis spots where all his so-called economist opponents utterly failed, and the whole science of economists has failed, and they should pack in and either study physical economy or learn to become a baker or some other useful profession, and not put out their stupid predictions any longer. Now, so this has grown. We have worked with Indira Gandhi. We have worked with the Chinese government on the Eurasian land bridge. We have many friends in Africa who know that our policy is the only hope for this continent. So the way to look at us as an organization is not just a group of a few people in one country, like the BÜSO, but we have for the last 40 or 50 years established ourselves as the alternative to the present oligarchical system by having proposed development perspectives for Africa, for the Oasis Plan for the Middle East, for the development of Latin America, Operation Juarez, the Eurasian land bridge, which later became the World Land Bridge. And, many people who believe that that is the better way to go, really know that we are representing a complete set of different principles than the present powers to be. And even more important, if you look at the popular cultural matrix which exists today in culture, in the youth culture, in other popular entertainment, in the almost loss of principles of classical composition in great classical music, in great classical poetry, well, then you can say that the work which was initiated by my husband, Lyndon LaRouche, and which has been contributed by many members of this organization since, well, we have revived, at a point where civilization almost was in a dark age, losing all of these precious treasuries from previous high points of civilization, and we have revived it. So that now people are studying Dante, Petrarca, Jeanne d'Arc, all kinds of beautiful poets and composers, and that would have been lost. And if you want to come to a Renaissance, you have to actualize the high points of previous periods in order as a jumping board for the next level of cultural Renaissance. So in a certain sense, even if we may be physically a relatively small force, I think the power of ideas, which we have demonstrated again and again in history, is something where if you join us as a movement, you are immediately a part of, and you participate and partake in that powerful force which we represent as an international movement. So, the question of what can you do as an individual, well, keep pestering your relatives, because, in each case, we had a similar experience. In the beginning, they say, oh, you are completely far off. And now many people say, oh, you were right. And, so don't be intimidated by, public opinion and vox populi, because most people have been brainwashed by the mass media. But we are now in such a tumultuous and absolutely traumatic period where this can change absolutely dramatically. Work on your own intellectual development, your own classical development, your own aesthetical education. Become a better human being for being able to contribute better to the development of the humankind at this grave moment of danger. And join the organization, because together you can do a lot. And we have proven again and again that we shape the debate. We have shaped the debate about galactic weather. We have shaped the debate about Glass-Steagall in Europe. A year ago, nobody knew what Glass-Steagall was. Trennbankensystem was almost unknown to anybody. Now everybody and his uncle is talking about it. So be confident that once you decide to do what is necessary, to do what Friedrich Schiller said, find your freedom in necessity, and then you are truly free, and that's the best chance you have to, make your life something extremely important for the outcome of this historical moment.
Well, thank you very, very much, Helga. I think that this extraordinary webcast gives all of us a lot to think about and reflect, and I think in many cases it might well be advisory to rewatch this webcast and get others to watch it, organize meetings where you can show it again. And I just want to point out something that's always strikes me whenever we have events of this nature, which should be much more often, which is that money, all the money in the world, could not buy the kinds of concepts and conceptual discussions, the kind of which we had tonight at this webcast. And for that reason alone, I think people should really reconsider what's possible for them to do, and at the very least, contribute to our movement wherever you are. And if you happen to be in a country where there is no formal organization, then help us to create one in your country. I hope there will be more such events in the near future. And I think this brings tonight's webcast to a conclusion. I really want to thank you very much, Helga, and also thank the audience, and I hope to see you all very soon.